Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Gearing Up for War, Clothes and Tools of Medal of Honor Recipients. I'm Noelle Wall. I am the Director of Education at the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, and this is Laura Jowdy, the Society's Director of Archives, Collections, and Museum.
Hello.
And we are on board the USS Yorktown at Patriots Point in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, which is the home of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society headquarters,
Exactly.
as well as the Society's museum, which is where we are located today.
Exactly.
And our room that displays the Medal of Honor, the Medals of Honor. And then we also have some objects from some of our exhibits that are around the museum.
Right.
And today we're going to be viewing a variety of objects connected to our webinar's theme, Gearing Up for War. And all of these are part of the Society's collection. If you're interested in learning more about how objects come to be part of the Society's collection or what else is a part of our collection, then I encourage you to watch some of our past webinars. You can see those on our website, and they're all going to be located in our video library. You can find out more about some other objects, including some medals of honor that are in the collection, and about the process of the archives, how you come to have those objects, and what the work of preserving them looks like. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more today as well.
You most certainly are.
Yeah. And on your screen, you're going to see a Q&A box. If you do have any questions for us, please feel free to drop those in that box. We will take a moment at several points during the webinar today to take those questions. We'll have some time at the end. And then anything that we don't have time to, or we aren't able to answer live, we will come back and try to get you an answer as soon as we can about any of those questions. As we discuss the items today, if you take a glance down in the chat box, you'll hopefully see some links that will take you directly to the pages of the Medal of Honor recipients we're going to talk about. If you're not joining us live, if you're watching recording, you'll be able to find those links in the webinar description that's going to be right below this video. I think that's all the information you need before we get started. Laura, thank you so much for bringing out all this wonderful stuff and being here to share it with us.
Absolutely. This week we have a rather full table, which I'm excited to share with everybody, especially with the enlarged versions of the Medals of Honor behind us. Like Noelle said, we're out here in the museum and we're happy to be here.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and talk about some of these objects that are going to tell us a little bit more about those experiences of Medal of Honor recipients with their tools and their clothing. So the first set of items we have is from the Civil War. So you want to get started telling us about that?
Okay, well, the first items we're going to talk about are from a recipient named Hartwell Compson. His family donated the items here for preservation and safekeeping, and of course sharing with our visitors and on webinars and any educational outreach we have. The collection we have today is, he was in the 8th New York Cavalry. And he received the Medal of Honor for capturing a flag, which was an important piece of communication equipment out in the field during the Civil War. It could communicate whether the unit was to move forward or retreat or hold the line. And so it was a very important piece. So when he captured that, it was capturing something that the enemy needed to communicate with its troops. So he received the Medal of Honor for that. What we have here from his today is a belt buckle. This says on it, NY for New York. I'm just going to flip it over so you can see the other side of it as well. And again, this is from the Civil War. And he started as enlisted, and by the time at the end of the Civil War, he had been breveted a lieutenant colonel. So he really performed well throughout the entire Civil War to get those kinds of commendations. Also of his, we have his cavalry gloves here. I'm just going to pick up the one of them. They're very delicate. These are made of leather. And if you can see, there's a little bit of some fancy sort of stitching. There's some wear on them. So they've clearly been worn and used. And you'll note that they come up further on the arm. I mean, I'm just going to pretend like I'm wearing it here. You'll see it comes almost up to my elbow. And that is to help protect the cavalry rider who's on a horse with the reins, but it also gives freedom of movement of the forearm. You see, I can still move my arm within that. So it gives you a little bit of extra protection further up on your arm while still allowing you range of motion when you're taking care of the horse. These are probably more worn when you're riding the horse, but the idea is that you're protected from the reins and clearly being able to still move. And then also connected with this collection came in a Civil War drum. And that was used actually by his cousin Mervyn, who was a drum boy. And these came in with that drum. You can see they clearly were used. I think this is a replacement head on one of these. I'm not sure which one is the replacement, but clearly used. And during the Civil War, drums were also used for communication. So that's why the drummer boy's role was so important. Different cadences could mean wake up. It could mean move forward, retreat. So if you couldn't see the flag, you could hear the drum and vice versa. So they're both important communication tools during the Civil War.
And, we think about modern communication as being immediate and quick, and communication is essential on a battlefield. It's communication in all military maneuvers. And so to be able to have a solution like the flag, like the drum, it really was an integral part of life.
Right. I mean, they didn't have radios back then, so they had to have different ways of communicating with their troops than what we have today.
Yeah. And you mentioned cavalry, and cavalry is a term we hear associated with our modern military as well, but it was truly a person who rode a horse. Right. So there was a lot of responsibility associated with being a member of the cavalry.
Exactly. And horses were sort of phased out. The last cavalry charge was in World War II, I believe. And so horses were slowly faded out, but cavalry has always been used as a way to really break the enemy's lines, their troops, whether it's usually you knew where the cavalry was, but sometimes you could surprise the enemy and rout them out using your cavalry. So it's going to be your heavy equipment, your horses. Today it's helicopters and armed equipment, armed vehicles, that sort of thing, tanks.
Yeah. So we have another object from the Civil War from another Medal of Honor recipient we're going to take a look at.
Yes. We have this powder flask from recipient Charles Depuy, and we talked about him last time as well. Again, another large collection that we have here at the archives and in the society's collections. You can see here it's got some dents, some discoloration. Over time, the strap has kind of worn off, and I'm willing to bet this is probably a replacement strap, this piece of twine. It might have been leather at one point, or it might have been another piece of twine. It's not the most stable material long term, but it certainly would serve this purpose because it's strong enough, to sling over your shoulder and keep track of. And obviously that was important to Depuy. He was a sharpshooter during the Civil War. He received the Medal of Honor, oddly enough, for being working some artillery pieces at Petersburg, Virginia. But as a sharpshooter, having your gunpowder nearby, safe, dry, ready to go is really important because your gun didn't work without it, and you were putting it in separate from your balls into your weapon. So
right. And an essential part of life in combat is the weapon, care of the weapon, and maintenance.
Maintenance, yes.
And there was a lot of training, obviously, that went into that, though a lot of people didn't come to the military with that knowledge, of course.
Right.
And I think you mentioned some came to the military who were in the cavalry with their own
yes.
their own horse.
Yes, there was times during the Civil War where horses were in short supply. So if you showed up to be in the cavalry and you brought your own horse, sometimes you get a bonus for it, depending how desperate they were. And I mean, they would give you a bonus for your horse because they were that desperate for that equipment. So
right. So the arming and equipping of the military has changed significantly.
Exactly.
The modern era. Yeah. So our next object really shows the vast kind of leap in technology from the Civil War. We're going to move into World War II now.
Right. And that is right here with this Luger, if I can reach around and pick it up easily enough here. Now, this is a piece that was captured by a Medal of Honor recipient named Frank Currey during the Battle of the Bulge. He received his Medal of Honor for action in the town of Malmedy, Belgium, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. But he basically became a one-man army. His platoon was trapped in a factory in the town, and he decided they weren't going to be trapped anymore and ran out. His platoon was, covering him from behind, but he ran out and used 4 different pieces of weaponry to rout the enemy and chase them out of town. So his platoon was free again. And in that process, I mean, he used a bazooka, he used a machine gun, he used his own rifle. And the idea, of course, was to surprise the enemy, and he certainly did that. So this piece here, he actually took off a German officer who was surrendering to him. And as he liked to tell it, he walked up to the man, took it off his hip and said, "This is mine now," and obviously brought it home with him. And that is on loan from his family.
So one thing with these Medal of Honor recipients, the action you just described, which you can read about more on our website and on his link to his page is in the chat, the ingenuity and kind of being able to think on your feet, also
Right.
knowing how to use a lot of different weapons that
Exactly.
you encounter, not just the ones that you come with.
Right. And I mean, in his case, obviously, I mean, when he was, if you read his citation, he was running from spot to spot throughout this town to gather the ammunition he needed to work the weaponry and as well as access the weaponry. And in the machine guns case, the machine gun operators had been killed, but he noticed it was available and dashed out under fire to get to that machine gun to take on the enemy. So just the knowledge of training of being able to use all those pieces of equipment is impressive. And then, of course, operating them under fire under those kind of situation is
Why
you know,
you
why he received the Medal of Honor. Exactly.
The belt as well.
Oh, yes. Let me go around here. This is his ammunition belt. Whoops. And this is a piece that would have been almost as important as the weapon itself, because of course, given its name, it's holding the ammunition. There's also, this is a first aid kit inside this pouch here. He may have had some of his tools for maintaining his weapon in here as well. So we've got some really interesting wear on this as well. And again, this is on loan from his family. So we're very grateful to be able to have this and share it with you today.
And so like we talked about last time, the Medal of Honor recipients and anyone else in combat, you're expected to carry everything with you, resupply, especially in World War II, was very challenging. And we need to think about, when we think about World War II, we might think about the action. We read Frank Currey's page, we see that kind of snapshot, that moment, but there's a lot of monotony. There's a lot of training. There's a lot of maintenance of what you have to be able to do your job.
Right. And, I've heard a lot of the recipients talk about how and veterans in general, they spend a lot of time sitting around, cleaning their weapons and maintaining their equipment. And then you have that fight with the enemy and then you wait around some more. So it really depends on the war as well and where you're stationed. But so it could have a really varied experience depending on where you're stationed and if you're part of the attacking or the advance, or if you're just being defender. So just, in the meanwhile, there's discipline involved. There's a lot of maintenance going into not only your weaponry, but your clothing as well to make sure it stays tip-top shape.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have another interesting object here from World War II from Medal of Honor recipient Nicholas Oresko.
Now this piece, I have to be very careful with. This Nicholas Oresko, World War II, as Noel said, and he was in Europe as well. And he received the Medal of Honor for taking out some enemy bunkers. And if I can just open this up. This is a silk map of France. And this is, first of all, I'm astounded it survived this long. This is a piece that he kept sewn in his jacket between the lining and the body of the jacket. And the purpose was, of course, that it's on fabric, so it bends with his body as he moves. But the idea was because it was sewn into his jacket, the enemy wouldn't find it if he was captured, and he could maybe use it to escape. So you see here, you've got major roads, you've got water, you got town, mountains going on over here. And the idea was, of course, that he could take this out of his jacket and use it to escape, or even if he got lost and separated from his unit, he could find his way back. We've got the German patrols noted down here, what areas are currently occupied of France at the time, and just the colors on this. I mean, I'm astounded this is still here, but it's a wonderful piece of history.
Yeah, it's fascinating and so smart to have something like that and to have it so well hidden, and to be able to survive the elements because of the material it's made from.
Exactly.
I think it also highlights the importance of archival work. Something like this that is made of fabric is very delicate, and keeping it preserved, because it is such an interesting and unique story. I'd never heard that people did this until you told me the story.
I mean, it makes sense though,
right?
It's kind of this logical. I mean, they saw a problem and they found a solution to it, and it was these maps that they kept on themselves hidden in compartments and zippers and between the linings of a jacket.
Yeah. And so some interesting stories from World War II. Our next set of objects is going to be from Vietnam.
Right. We are going to look at some items from James Fleming, who was cavalry, modern cavalry. He was well, he is, or at the time, he's still alive, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But he was a pilot, and he received the Medal of Honor for flying in under heavy, heavy fire and doing some really interesting maneuvers to evacuate some wounded and some trapped soldiers when he knew that was what he was flying into, and he volunteered for the mission. So he received the Medal of Honor for that. So what we have here, these are his boots that he wore in Vietnam. If you want to get close, again, you can see the wear on them, where he actually wore them. And these boots are very, very heavy. They've got some definite, I'd say metal toes for certain, metal at the heel, and also in the body of the shoe a little bit, I think, for some reinforcement and some strength. So these are great pieces of history as well.
And one of the interesting things, he's flying, so he's not necessarily on the ground, but anytime you're in a plane, in a helicopter, on a horse, you have to plan for the potential that you could be on the ground, that you could be in different conditions. So having the boots, having the uniform, having everything else that's ready to meet the needs of whatever the environment is important.
Exactly. And so he's prepared as well, and with the strength, and then they're made out of a canvas material, so they're a little bit water repellent, which is important when you're in a jungle tropical situation.
Right.
So, I mean, he was ready. Some other items we have from him. These are his gloves. Now, remember, we looked at Compson's gloves earlier, which were made for horse. And these gloves are aviator gloves made for flying a helicopter. So again, you see the different materials. This one has some leather in the palms, and it's got fabric on the rest of it. But you can see you've still got a little bit of length past the wrist, but certainly nothing like you would with the horse cavalry. I love contrasting these two sets, because it's the same unit, if you will. They're, okay, on the broad sense, they're the same unit, but they have different purposes, and their equipment matches that purpose.
Right. It really shows the change in military transportation.
Exactly.
Frankly, over time.
Exactly. Well, speaking of military transportation, I'm going to make our camera lady come in closer again. This is also from James Fleming, and I find this fascinating. This is a computer air navigation dead reckoning tool. And to tell you the truth, I don't know how to use it. It's got lots of little dials and functions. Perhaps I'll ask him to tell me how to use it at some point. But it's a computer in the same way, say, a slide rule would have been. It dates back to Vietnam and helps him fly appropriately once he knows all these settings. I think they're asking for air temperature and altitude computations. So some of this he's still doing himself, and we have his notebooks as well where he's done the computations to be able to put them into this tool and help himself fly.
Fascinating.
Certainly.
So we had the chance to look at a weapon from Civil War and World War II, yes. And now we have Vietnam, yes.
And this is a fascinating piece because while it's from Vietnam, it's also a weapon that was first produced in the late 19th century. So I'm just going to pick this up. This is a bolt action rifle, and it was produced in the Soviet Union. It was captured by Medal of Honor recipient James Sprayberry off a North Vietnamese soldier. Now, I don't know if y'all can see this. It's very tiny, but you can see the hammer and sickle right in there. And there is some Russian symbols right here, some Cyrillic alphabet. It says 1948 on there, so I'm willing to bet that's the year of manufacture. But it's an interesting piece, especially when you consider that this is honestly pretty archaic compared to the M16s that our troops were carrying at the time. So in any case, I find, again, you're comparing and contrasting, even what opposite forces would have.
Right. And so, we look at all these weapons and all these objects and everything. So what story do we see as we kind of look at these in totality?
Well, certainly the advancement of technology, right?
Right. Yeah.
I don't have a modern radio or a GPS phone I can share with you, but I mean, you've gone from, drumsticks and flags to all the way up to, headsets that our modern soldiers wear in their ears, with a microphone. So that's fascinating. You see that overall story, but also what you still see is the survival of this equipment because it's been so well cared for. And again, that's the training and the discipline that our troops get.
Right. And I know we talked a little bit about the speed of war as well,
Yeah.
just how slow war was in the Civil War compared to what we see today and what we saw in Vietnam or Korea.
Right. The ability to rapidly get our sailors, soldiers, airmen, Marines from one location to another quickly has certainly advanced. I mean, we're talking days on days and ends of marching in the Civil War, large groups of men marching together to, certainly we have soirees, and don't get me wrong, some of our guys still do that. Let's not say they don't, but still the ability to be able to fly in and precisely insert somebody where you want them or near where you want them has advanced miraculously.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Absolutely. So we have looked at some clothing items so far.
Yes.
Both we looked at something last time, and then we had boots and gloves, kind of those accessories. Obviously, the clothing service members wore during combat is essential to their success.
Yes, absolutely.
So we are going to talk a little bit more about some objects that are clothing items that Medal of Honor recipients might have worn either in combat or in a more ceremonial sense.
Right. And at the end of the last webinar, I shared a jungle fatigue shirt, jacket that Charles Hagemeister wore and during the Vietnam War. But today I want to share in particular this jacket here on my right, your left. This is a flight jacket that belonged to Charles Loring, and he was a pilot during the Korean War. He flew an F-80, and he received the Medal of Honor because he fought bravely in the skies. And then when his plane was damaged, he crash landed it into a gun emplacement that he was sent out to dive bomb. And because his plane was damaged, he could no longer do that, but he was going to take out that gun emplacement by any means possible. So he sacrificed his own life to take out that gun emplacement that was threatening troops on the ground. And this piece, it doesn't have any unit patches or anything on it. So I believe this was probably a training jacket that he wore in training, or maybe he was a civilian pilot as well and, flew it in his recreation time. In either case, this is a wonderful piece of history. And you'll see down here, you've got a little bit of this knitwear down here, and then also at each wrist. And that's because back then they had a little bit less pressurization inside planes and it'd get colder quicker. Maybe some of you have experienced that. I know I have, where the plane gets really cold the higher up you get. Same situation. So you have this nice thick heavy jacket to protect himself and keep himself warm up in those altitudes.
So why do you think, in your opinion as an archivist, is it important to preserve these clothing items? We looked at some of these items that are made of wood or metal that are a little easier to preserve. Right. And obviously clothing is going to be issued to everyone. It's going to be pretty similar from soldier to soldier, Marine to Marine. What story do these pieces of clothing tell us that it's important to keep them around?
Well, as a history nerd, I love these pieces because they've actually touched somebody. Again, all this equipment, and we know who they belong to and who is using them. And it's all a part of that personal connection we can make. On this, I can see the wrinkles where he moved his arms. I can see up here by the neck where maybe he sweated a little bit more. We've got some pieces that are a little bit more worn in the leather. And it's just, the wear and the tear is part of the story, and it's how we can connect these historical figures and realize these aren't just stories. We read these Medal of Honor citations and it's, oh, how did he do that? He must be superhuman and all that. But I love also then that we can show something like this that says he was a real human being. And I take inspiration from that because it means that anybody can do anything extraordinary. Yeah. It's circumstances, it's the willingness to act, it's the, realizing there's a problem, and it's the awareness that we were talking about before as well, as, knowing what's going on around you and just taking that moment and seizing it and doing what you can to help others. Yeah.
And it's pretty rare to have something that was actually in combat. It's hard. It's much more likely to have some of the other objects that we're going to talk about in a moment, but These ones that actually went into combat, you talk about the gloves,
Mhm.
think about the uniforms that they might have been wearing during their
Mhm.
action itself, though a lot were awarded posthumously, so of course we wouldn't have any of that anyway. But when you're in that moment, you might not think that it's important. You know, especially with a lot of the recipients, you'll
Mhm.
hear when you see their videos, them talking about, I wasn't doing anything special, I was just doing my job.
Yeah.
So for them, these clothing items have, in the moment, have no special meaning. It's
Right.
just,
Or
this
the
is what I
equipment.
was wearing while I was doing my job. This is
And-
the piece of equipment I had while I
And-
was carrying out a mission.
It's kind of like my saving this shirt, because this is
Right.
the shirt I wore when I did this webinar. I mean, this is my job and I love it. And this is what I was trained to do. And these guys think of it the same way. You know,
Right.
this is my job. This is my training. I'm going to apply it the best way I know how.
Right. Whereas we now going back and trying to capture those moments in history, and you
Yes.
collecting these items and using them to tell that story,
Yeah.
it's important work, and it definitely helps us kind of understand the bigger picture.
Right.
So we're going to move on from talking about those kind of in combat object clothing items and talk a little bit more about ceremonial clothing. But
Mhm.
before we get into the items themselves, I just want to ask you kind of from your perspective as a
Mhm.
historian slash history nerd, as you said, what is the purpose of those ceremonial uniforms? Obviously, it's something that's been there for years and maybe has increased in fanciness or decreased in fanciness at different points in time. But
Right.
what is the purpose of the?
Well, a lot of it is unity of the troops. I mean, if you're all wearing the same thing, I mean, mind you, it's going to change from person to person based on rank and what conflicts they've been in, what awards they've been given. But it's also just the unity of the whole unit. It's also, each one of these is almost, it's like, I believe one point Noel called it a wearable resume. And that's really a very good way to think of it. Because you're going to have your rank, you're going to have, you know, some insignia that attaches to your training, whether you're qualified, you know, a sharpshooter or a parachutist or something like that. You're also going to have, you know, your accomplishments. That's what your ribbon rack is for. So your unit's going to be on there. I mean, it's a wearable resume, really. It's
A way to connect you with all the different things you've done in the military.
Exactly. And it lets others know, you know, so I know whether you're a lieutenant and I need to salute you. I know they know that I'm, you know, a private and they can order me around. And, you know, it's all about discipline as well then, because in order in the military.
And that discipline is evident in the uniform, the polish, the precision with which everything is applied, and how it's worn with respect, things like that.
And there's rules, of course, about which insignia goes where and where the ribbons go. There's a precedence in the order, and believe me, you will get in trouble if you put them in the wrong order. Somebody will notice and mention it to you. So that's something that troops and veterans are very cognizant of, is making sure their ribbons are in the right order.
Yeah. So we're going to look at a couple of uniform pieces here.
We are. I'm going to shove Noel away. Over here, we got, this is Richard McCool. He was Navy World War II on Okinawa, is where he received his Medal of Honor from. You can see he's got his ribbons. He's got his rank is on the sleeves. The Navy puts them down on the sleeves. So we've got a commander's, I believe that is, I can't see the whole thing, is down on his sleeves. And that is not a combat jacket, and it's not the fanciest, if you will, either. It is sort of middling. He'd wear that if he was meeting his superior officer on certain occasions. The military is very good about letting you know what your dress is for the day. You're going to wear, you know, your BDUs, you're going to wear your service dress, your mess dress. They're going to tell you for what event you're going to wear it. And this other one here on the table, this belonged to William Zuiderveld, and he received the Medal of Honor for action at Veracruz, Mexico in 1914. He obviously served all the way through World War II. We've got his Medal of Honor ribbon here, and he was a hospital apprentice at the time, so he was in the medical corps. So you have here, I think everybody's pretty familiar with that, with the snakes twining up the staff on his shoulder boards. And then the last one we have, this is Charles Murray's service dress. We've got his name here, his ribbons, we've got his insignia, his qualifiers. Here on the side, I don't know if y'all can see this, We've got some patches related to his unit he served in. And obviously he kept this in tip-top shape. He himself donated this to us. And it's been a great piece in our collections as well. And he received the Medal of Honor for World War II. He, like Francis Currey, kind of became a one-man army, taking on over 200 Germans, pretty much by himself. Yes, it is.
One other thing we talked about with these uniforms was the idea that you're sending a message. The idea that as military conflict has evolved over time, you know, we talked about the Civil War, and you blundered about, it's not the right word because it was strategic, but there was a lot of chance about encounters, and people were slow to receive messages, things like that. And we move into a time toward World War II where it's being broadcast. You know, you're seeing it when you go to the movies, you're seeing it on news. And there's a lot more visual assigned to military action. And so you're really seeing it on television and now
you have drones and you have satellite imagery and some of those things. I mean, I'm just always amazed with how close they can get with the satellites of what they can capture with those satellite imagery. And you can locate an enemy, I think, much more easier now than you could back then.
Oh, absolutely. One thing that we taught that I wanted to bring up that we don't necessarily have examples of here, but I know for anyone who has seen military uniform examples, camouflage, kind of how that has changed over time and what it looks like today versus before.
And there's actually whole studies. I mean, people in the military, of course, studies this a lot. What works best in what kind of environment and what kind of situation. You're talking temperature, you're talking the surroundings, you're talking vegetation, I mean, they have done massive studies of this, and historians love to look at this and look at the different patterns and how they've evolved over time. Especially, I mean, even ships, they've done camouflage on ships. So it's a huge area of study, and there's a reason for that. And that's because we get better and better and better at it the more we study it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have one more ceremonial item that we're going to talk about here.
We do. This ceremonial sword, and it's ceremonial, it was not used in combat. This is the type of sword. This is a Navy officer sword. And this one belonged to, and I know it's hard to see, I apologize to people watching, but it belonged to James Stockdale. So you can see here, J.B. Stockdale is here in the finish. And we've got different motifs going all the way down, including we've got the Navy symbols there. And on the other side, we've got a few more. We've got USN here. And then here we've got the gold braiding here on the handle. And this is something he would have used again in ceremonial reasons. And he would probably not be happy that it's been allowed to tarnish a bit because, again, the maintenance and all of that. But again, it shows the age of it and that it belonged to Medal of Honor recipient from the Vietnam War.
So fascinating collection. These physical objects are part of the society's collections in general, but another important part are the videos that are available on our website. And in a lot of those videos, you might see clips of recipients receiving the Medal of Honor.
Yes.
And so in those, you might see a variety of levels of ceremony and different types of clothing. So what is the expectation of a Medal of Honor recipient who's receiving the Medal of Honor and what they dress like?
You know, they're receiving the Medal of Honor. So I don't know anybody's going to be too picky about what they wish to wear as long as they're wearing clothes. But in particular, nowadays, you're probably going to see them in sort of this level of dress, the service dress. But if you look at a few others, you will see them in civilian dress, particularly during the Vietnam War. People who had gotten out of the service will sometimes show up, you know, in a nice suit. And one of the things we hear about a lot is, you know, well, nowadays it's so formal, and you look at these old ones. I mean, some of the ones during World War II, it was presented at parade, like right after a battle. You know, they'd have a formal parade or formal muster, and they'd present it to the recipient then. So he's wearing his combat clothes. Today, it has a little bit more pomp and ceremony, which is befitting. So it's usually, nowadays, it's at the White House.
But a lot of commendations of various sorts are given out on the battlefield.
Oh, absolutely.
In those formations.
Absolutely.
As a way to keep up troop morale and to reward
Yeah,
actions quickly. Whereas the
yes,
Medal of Honor has that kind of higher level, which results in that level of ceremony.
right,
and
right.
The appropriate clothing. And sometimes we do see folks who, are wearing those very formalized uniforms during that ceremony.
Right, exactly.
All right, well, I'm going to check and see if we have any more questions. Are there any other stories that you missed of the objects on the table that we wanted to cover?
Not particularly. I mean, I love them all, so it's hard to pick what to talk about more, and I certainly don't want to do that and bore the viewers.
So we did have a question
yes.
about the silk mat.
Okay.
It's fascinating,
It is.
course, which we all agree, I think. Do you have any other examples of escape or evasion materials in the collection or that you've come across?
Not objects per se, but we certainly have a few accounts of, evasion or written accounts, and how it was done. We've got a couple recipients who received the medal for actions that involved, they put themselves out there and then got cut off and they had to find their way back to their unit. So that became part of their citation. One I can think of offhand is Brian Thacker. We have ones who actually served time as POW, such as Stockdale. He actually has several books out about his experience. He received his Medal of Honor as a POW in Vietnam for his leadership in extreme resistance to interrogation techniques. So we don't really have anything else that's related to necessarily that's an object, but we certainly have written counts.
Yeah, and we do have, as you mentioned, a number of Medal of Honor recipients who are POWs who
Yes.
talked about kind of what that experience was like. And,
Exactly. Leo Thorsness is another one.
All right, in terms of the actual uniforms themselves and conservation, I know we've covered this a little bit in some of the other webinars, but when you get some of these objects, kind of what is your approach? And if something does need to be repaired or there's something else that needs to be done, or do you do that in-house? Do you have somebody come do that?
Well, mostly what I'm trying to do is preservation. I can do a little bit of conservation work, like simple things, but I'm certainly not trained and I don't have the equipment to work and do true conservation work. That I would send to somebody else. Like earlier this year, we had some Medal of Honor certificates and a few other certificates of Medal of Honor recipients that we sent to a paper conservator up in Columbia, South Carolina, and they did a beautiful job. They took out some of the spots, they cleaned it up, and they applied a deacidic bath to them, which helps pull out, because all paper is very acidic and it will eat itself over time. And so what they do is they treat it to kind of try to negate some of that and make it last longer. And they also repaired a few of the holes, and that involves a whole lot of science and a whole lot of chemicals. And they're trained to do that. And it's the same thing with the uniforms. I know the question was specifically about the uniforms. There are people who are specifically trained to work on historical pieces of clothing and work with the fabrics and apply some treatments to it. Mostly these are in pretty good condition with the exception of this leather jacket. And that's just because leather is extremely hard to conserve. And I've been looking, if anybody watching knows a leather conservator, please let me know, because I've been looking for one for many years now. But the idea of conservation is not necessarily to erase the age of it, but rather to preserve the object over time for a little bit longer. So these uniforms are in really good condition for the most part. So really what I do with them is when they're on display, they're rotated off display. And that's really a good museum practice. And all museums should do that. You don't want something on display all the time. Number one, because then you aren't showing other things when you could be rotating them in and out. But it also wears on the objects. Light is a horrible thing. It can fade the fabrics. And this sounds crazy, I know, but people walking by a case shift the air inside the case in a way so that we call it a microenvironment inside the case. And I'm sorry, I could go on forever about this, but the microenvironment inside the case can be altered by a lot of different factors, and that can harm the items as well. So if you're rotating them in and off, they get a little bit of a rest when they're off display, which is good for the objects. And
for the public.
Well, yeah, and for the public, because of course they're seeing different stuff if they come and visit again. So a lot of these things we've taken out of the boxes today, it's not that they're never seeing the light of day, it's that they are resting. Is what I like, and they'll come out again at some point. But we have special boxes we put in, we have special tissue we put in to help support the jackets. We lay them out like somebody's actually wearing them and kind of stuff them like they're still wearing them and put them in special acid-free boxes. And we store them in a temperature-controlled environment. So temperature is really important. So if you have something old you're looking to preserve, do not put it in your garage or your attic unless you have some kind of environmental control in those areas, because you want to try to keep the temperature as steady as possible, because it's really going to help with the longevity.
It sounds like it's important to create that network of other experts in those specific fields.
It's invaluable. It is invaluable to make contact with other archivists, other curators, and people like conservators, like the paper people up in Columbia. So.
Well, I think we have answered all of the questions.
Okay.
If anybody else does have questions, then please continue to chat those in. We'll be happy to follow up afterwards.
Or you can email us. Our emails are on the website.
Yes, absolutely. You can find us on social media and ask questions there, and we'll get back to you with as many answers as we possibly can.
Absolutely.
And I hope you all will be able to join us for our next webinar. We're going to discuss a little bit more about life after war.
Yes.
So our series so far has really focused on the everyday life in war, and then the kind of experiences of combat and the tools and clothes necessary for that. We're going to focus on what happens when you come home,
right?
Reintegrate in society, continue on in the military outside of a combat environment, and kind of what the Medal of Honor recipients' legacy means to them, and how they have taken that action and looked to make an impact on other people.
Right.
So that's what we'll be focusing on the next webinar, and I hope you'll all be able to join us then. As I mentioned, you can find information about all these recipients either in the chat if you're here live, or in the description if you're watching the recorded version. You can also find everything you can need on our website, cmohs.org. If there's anything you don't see, then please reach out and we'll be happy to find the information for you.
Absolutely.
We also would like to thank our sponsors. We rely heavily on those who are able to financially support the work that we do. The Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, the Bruce McCaw Family Foundation, Delta Airlines, American Airlines, Fisher House. To find out more about those supporters and others, or how you can help donate to continue the work that Laura does, that the society does, then please visit our website and you can find out all the information that you need there. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Laura, for sharing all of these items with us. If you do find yourself in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, then please stop by the museum at Patriots Point and see some of these objects as well as many others up close. And check out all the work that we do that's available on our website. And we hope to see you on a future webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.